I love the idea of a practitioner is someone who practices. And so to practice something, to get fluency, to get skillfulness, it's really worth repeating a process and many times, keeping coming back to it. It's like if you want to play a song or recite a poem, you might do it many, many times until it comes from a deeper place within you. And it's similar with the idea of stories of resilience, that if you practice this storyboarding process, the more you practice it, the more familiar it becomes. And I'm going to invite us to do a 6-part storyboard. And if you've got a big sheet of paper or a notebook, you might just divide it into 6 compartments like we have here, just into 6 compartments. And we're going to work through what I call the shift storyboard, where those letters SHIFTS, each one stands for a different part of the storyboard. And the starting point is that sense of here's me, or it might be here's me supporting someone facing the challenge of, or it might be here's us facing the challenge of. You can do that in these 3 different ways. And I'm going to invite you to just be thinking about that. If you'd like to, and there's no requirement here, you might be happy to write that in the chat window, just so we have a sense of what are some of the stories of resilience we're supporting here. But also, if you prefer to keep that more private, certainly support you in that. This is a practice you can come back to again and again, and you can watch this recording or also engage in some of the free courses. There's a free resilience course I've got that guides people through this. So let's work our way through this. So okay, here's our starting point. It might be here's me facing the challenge of, or here's me supporting whoever it is facing the challenge of, or here's us facing the challenge of. And I wonder, Madeline, whether there's anything that's coming up in the chat window yet of what's being named as some of the adversities, or whether you've got something that you're thinking of that you would like to use this webinar to support you in facing.
I'm just seeing that Sergio was naming facing ongoing financial problems at a time where he's received a gift in form of a grant for a project deep to his heart. So that's a starting point for him. And then Alison naming here's us facing the challenge of massive climate anxiety. And that's, I'd say, for me, one for me is us facing the challenge of the toxicity of our cultures, increasing toxicity of our cultures. That would be my one.
Yes. And already, just with 3 things on the table, you might think, how can you have an approach that helps all these different things? How can you have an approach that can, on the one hand, help deal with financial problems, and on the other hand, face something as huge as the climate crisis that we're facing, or facing larger toxic cultures, that particularly the kind of hate cultures and that very disturbing events in the bigger world. So how can you have an approach that's facing these many different things? And just come back to the idea of a story pattern. A story pattern is something that can happen on many different levels. And so if we just come back to the sharing, and so we're starting a storyboard, and a storyboard is about identifying some of the different elements in the story. And when I teach resilience, I'm particularly interested in customizable frameworks, a framework that you can apply in different situations at different levels. And so when we talk about the story of resilience, there's always some kind of adversity, and it might be in the past, it might be in the present, it might be in the future, or a combination of all 3 of those. But in this story, okay, there's something going on, and but also I love this idea of we talked about the spider diagram, where whatever your starting point, recognizing that it can go many different ways. And so the second part of the storyboard, if S is for starting point, H is for hopes, where you say, okay, whatever it is you've named, what would you like to happen here? What's your hoped for outcome? And I'm going to invite all of you to do that. So if you're thinking about an adversity you're facing or someone you're supporting, what do you think they would hope for? What would you hope for in relation to them? So some of the things that they're facing financial problems, you may have a particular idea of what you'd like to happen. That there may be particular situations or concerns you have that I hope I can find a way of dealing with this, hope I can find a way of dealing with that. But also in the bigger picture too, you might think, okay, there's some things that I actually can't see as possible now, but even with the things that aren't possible, there's still a range of things that are. So if I focus on what's the best that I could see that could happen, what would that look like? What do I hope for? You might write this down as you're going on, as we're going through the webinar, or you might come back and do this afterwards. I'm really wanting to plant this framework because if we're looking at how do we become an agent of well-being, one of the real things that makes a difference is agency. Agency is where we feel there are things that we can do that can make a difference. And what supports our agency is having good tools. Good tools. And so that's why I'm very interested in teaching about resilience tools. And so this storyboarding is one of those. So you start from acknowledging what you're facing, you identify what you hope for, but then the I, the SHI, so we're talking about shift storyboard, the I stands for in the way of your hopes. Obstacles or difficulties include. And I want to acknowledge that sometimes there can be so much in the way that we can just think, what's the point of even trying? And I want to acknowledge that despair can be a step along the way, that it can be a chapter in the story. And a term that I've discovered quite recently is the idea of through-topia. I learnt about this from Manda Scott. She's a writer, and also she learnt about it from Rupert Reed, who's been very involved in Extinction Rebellion and wrote a very important article about Throughtopia. And what I like about the idea of Throughtopia, the way I've come to understand it, is that sometimes when all seems lost, a Throughotopian adventure is about how you find a way through. And in order to find a way through something, you need to know what it is you want to find a way through. And there's been very interesting research about the difference between sort of the idea of effortless success, people who thought about a task and thought it would be easy, and another group who thought about a task and also gave a lot of attention to all the problems that they might bump into. And giving attention to the problems you might bump into might seem to be negative thinking, but in fact, it's also about realistic thinking. And the group who did that actually did better. There's something about acknowledging what's in the way, but then looking at what helps us deal with that. And so that's what we come to afterwards. But let's look at what's in the way. You might have identified something you hope for, challenge you're facing, you'd know how you'd like it to go, but what's in the way for you? And Madeline, I'm just going to call in here just to say, is there anything that's coming up in the chat window in terms of either hopes or obstacles?
Yeah, and so the hope. So Jean was us facing a challenge of getting a no more silence group, a normal message, which normally feels like it requires silence by others. And then the hope there was to find the people in positions that are in a place to be open. And I added a hope which I hadn't put in yet for my one, which was hoping for the flourishing of new cultures that are positive and supportive of harmonious life on Earth. And Heather saying acceptance was a real issue that I now recognize was holding back.
Yes, thank you. What I'm picking up, what you've already describing, Madeline, is the relationship between part one and part two in this storyboard. that there's something about when you start by with the starting point, it can seem a bit overwhelming. It's like, okay, here's me facing this, what can I do? It's too big. But what I noticed was that when you identified the hopes, they were very specific and linked to the challenges that have been named in part one. And this is something about how you can have a general framework that can be customized to befit a particular situation. So I'm going to invite you all to then think about, okay, there's things you hope for, but what's in the way? Because part of finding a way through this lovely term, through-topia, and through-topia I think of as the adventure of finding a way through. What does that look like? And what is it you want to find a way through? So I know for myself, for example, one of my challenges at the moment is developing an online training business. I've set up this collegeofwellbeing.com, and there's all kinds of challenges along the way. But when I can recognize them, one of them is just simply having too many things to do. And just by the way, out of interest, let's just do a quick poll here. How many people identify that you've identified hopes, but one of the things that gets in the way is just having far too much to do? Hands up if that's true of you. So I'm seeing quite a few hands there, and it's something about the thank you that it's recognizing that there are common challenges in this journey of resilience, and we need to kind of then say, well, okay, acknowledging that, what's going to help me here? And so this next part of the storyboard is about saying, okay, facing all that, what helps me is, and in this webinar, you may not come to the final list of what helps you find a way, but there's something here about identifying a process that you can apply. And even if it's just holding the question, okay, what is it that helps me here? What is it that helps me here? Maybe I'm not sure. Let's look at that issue of overload. It's a common one here. Facing all of that, what helps? So if our obstacle and difficulty is bumping into far too much to do, let's take that as an example. Facing all of that, what helps me is, and I want to share with you some of the things that I use and teach in resilience training. And these are some of my core tools. And one of the first, and anyone who's done training with me, you might think, oh, not this again. But actually, it's a dear old friend. This is a dear old friend, this image that I came across. It was nearly 40 years ago. It was in about the mid 1980s. I came across this way of looking at well-being. I learned about it from Professor Patrick Pietroni, pioneer of the holistic approach. And he said that sometimes well-being, is like rowing along merrily, things going well. And a problem, a well-being problem, challenge, like an illness of my background is a medical doctor, seeing people who crash into well-being problems or illnesses or injury, illness, disease, and that's like crashing into a rock. But actually, a rock is really a way of thinking about any kind of problem. It might be that when you're overloaded, you might crash into the rock of burnout. You might crash into the rock of exhaustion. You might be more likely to get sick from a range of other things. So the water level is like our level of resourcing. The rock is what we crash into. The important thing here is that in terms of dealing with problems, it's very common for people to focus on the rocks. And that was what I trained as a medical doctor. I'd be a bit like a geologist, really. I'd be there asking about, tell me about the rock. What does it look like? Let me know about the rocks, because I knew a lot about rocks. But as well as the rock, there's the water level. And when the water level is low, we're more likely to crash. And this is a way of thinking about resilience and well-being, that they're like a reserve, that when it's depleted, when we're at a low ebb, we're more likely to hit rocks. And there's something here also about your own resilience ability, your own bounce ability, that you tend to cope less well when you're depleted. And if you think about this for yourself, you're probably aware of some of the things that when they're low, they leave you feeling less able to cope with things. I tend to cope less well when you might write in the chat window. I tend to cope less well when I don't know, Madeline, have you got any ideas for yourself? You tend to cope less well when.
I was just putting them in there. When my diet has got a bit random. Um, and yeah, I also resonate with what Geraldine's just put, which is I'm tired. And facing uncertainties and huge challenges. Um, and when I don't sleep well again with genes, I think there are ones that are quite common to most of us. And also I think when for me, it's also when I get too stagnant, I don't move around enough or not getting out in nature.
Right, thank you. This is so helpful because what we're identifying here are these are risk factors. And if we're looking at how we build resilience, and by the way, in terms of being a resilience practitioner, this is a resilience practice. And we've been doing this recently with our Suha group, where we're actually doing this as a kind of physical gesture. We say, here's our water level and here's my boat. And you might do this yourself. You might just kind of say, how's my water level? How's my boat? Sometimes you'll know you'll be at a low level. Sometimes you're feeling like more resourced. But you might even just say this to yourself. It's a self communication. You might just say, how's my water level doing? It's a way of checking in with yourself. Sometimes people think of this as a kind of inner emotional bank balance. But also when we talk about resilience practices, this is like a check-in practice. But what we're also doing is then inviting our attention to focus on the upward arrows. I tend to cope better when. And I'm going to invite you to write in the chat window, what are the times you cope better? And this might be something you do if you're teaching resilience or if you're coaching for resilience. You might explore with people the factors that deplete their well-being, leave them more run down, are risk factors for crashing into a rock. But you might also explore with them, okay, what are the upward arrows here? And when we're looking at upward arrows, what we're looking at are resilience factors. And so in terms of resilience training, it's a lot of it is can think of it as a bit like upward arrowology. And my friend Carlotta Cataldi, who in my book 7 Ways to Build Resilience, she had this lovely image, and it's this idea that upward arrows have a buffering effect. And another way of thinking about that buffering effect is with buoyancy. You might just have this image of a cork floating on water. It floats because it's got a lot of buoyancy. And so thinking for yourself when you're facing something difficult, what supports your buoyancy? If it's a group or a community, there's a lovely term, social capital. Social capital is the wealth of relationships in a community that adds to that community's resilience, its social, its buoyancy. But also when working with people around building their resilience, I like to look at different groups of upward arrows. And again, this may be something, if you've worked with me before, you're familiar with. But if you haven't come across this before, it's a very helpful model because what we're doing here is we're looking at a resilience toolkit that has 4 compartments. There are strategies, things you do. There are strengths that you draw upon, resources that you turn to, and insights that you're guided by. And those letters SSRI, I think of this as the SSRI Resilience Toolkit. You might have come across these letters in relation to antidepressants, the commonest group of antidepressants, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Prozac's an example, but I'm using them here very intentionally to point to what I think of behavioral antidepressants, recognizing that things we do, choices we make, actions we take can have an antidepressant effect. And you might think of this for just yourself, just okay, we're looking at a strategy here, storyboarding. Mindfulness may be a practice that some of you use, going for a walk, using problem solving tools. When we're doing trainings, often get people into breakout rooms if it's online or small groups if it's face to face, and say, have a sharing circle where we say, what are your favorite resilience tools? What are the strategies that you draw upon, the strengths you turn to, the resources? And by resources, I mean this thing about what do you turn to for nourishment, inspiration, guidance, or support? That can be people. It might also be books. It might also be places. And just out of interest, if do another quick poll here. Hands up if there's a pet that's an important resource for you that supports your resilience. So a number of people, just what is it we turn to? And recognizing that pets, people, places, self-help books, these are our resilience resources. And that if you recognize the value of a resource, you can give more attention to looking after those. Okay, so I'm going to invite you to, after this webinar, to take some time and just think, what is it that helps me? If I was to do this storyboard of starting with the S, starting point, here's me facing, or here's me supporting someone who's facing, whatever it is they're facing, or here's us facing. And then you identify your hopes, what you'd like to happen, and then the obstacles or difficulties in the way of the hopes. But then also what helps you deal with those obstacles. Now, I love the idea of a storyboard. And one of the reasons why I love stories and using this idea of restoring through restoring is in great stories, there are turning points. That great stories might begin with awfulness, but there are turning points along the way where something that seemed to be getting worse began to get better. And I'm guessing that you've had experience of that in your own lives. And I just wonder how many of you have had the experience of a situation that seemed very, very difficult and you thought, I'm never going to find a way of dealing with this. Or maybe there was something you wanted to do and you thought, I'd really love to, but I can't see it happening. But then a turning or shift happened. If there is an example of one of those, I'm going to invite you just to write it in the chat window. Write in the chat window, what's the turning that you've had? What are times where something seemed really impossible, but something happened that really shifted it? And I am bringing here my experience. I worked for many years in addictions recovery, and where some of my clients had said to me, Chris, I've given up giving up because I can't see it working. But I remember the person who said that, and actually that or similar sentiments were expressed a number of times by different people. I saw a number of times later where a turning or shift had happened. And if you know turning points can happen, you can look for ways to help them happen. Just like that circle of squares, maybe you can't make the turning point happen, but you can help it happen. Just recognizing that a turning might happen opens you to that possibility, and then you can look for ways to help that possibility. Now, a beginning sentence I use is, a turning or shift might happen if I were to. And I know that often this is one of the most difficult sentence starters, because if you're at the beginning of a story and this is in front of you, you don't know what will lead to a turning point, but you can guess. So if you had something like, if I were to guess an area that I acted on that helped things shift, what would I guess? A turning or shift might happen if I were to. And if you're looking at collective resilience, you might think a turning or shift might happen if we were to. But in the we, there is also the I. So you might say, okay, if we were to, and what would it look like if I started doing that? So this is something about becoming an agent of well-being through identifying our agency, our role in the story, the part that we can play. And getting really interested in turning points and shifts is part of resilience training. In the resilience practitioner training I run, we go into this in much more detail. But I'm just going to go on one last step. This is a 6-part storyboard. I'm going to invite you to come to the final step. And if any of you have been completing this storyboard, you've been following it through with a situation that you face or that you're supporting someone else in, or a larger collective situation. Then the last part, I think this is the deal maker really, is about identifying specific steps that you can take in the next 7 days. So when you're looking at the resilience challenge you face, what can you do in the next 7 days? Maybe just have a little time to reflect on that.